Thomas here, and I've got Lou from Tropic Marin with me, and we're going to talk about something that seems like a subject that gets talked about often, but I feel like has a lot of confusion around it still. So I want to drill down to the bottom of dosing, two-part calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, everything we need. Dosing. How do you pick the right dosing for you? Which is the best? Just let's demystify this because it's still a problem for a lot of people. So let's start with the big question. What's the best method for dosing calcium and alkalinity? It's a loaded question.
Do you know how many people call me and say, what's the best way to do this? The best way to do it is the way that's going to work easily with however you want to maintain your system. Because there is no best way. There's lots of different ways. That's why we offer more than just one way to do this. And it's going to depend on how you want to maintain your system and how your system runs. So let's talk about why you might want to do one or the other.
That sounds like a solid plan.
All right.
I knew it was a loaded question.
So let's start with, you have the balling method right in front of you there. So let's start with the original balling method designed by Hans Werner Balling back in the 90s.
Awesome.
Because everything kind of comes off of that.
Absolutely.
All right. So in the true balling method, you've got a part A, which is calcium chloride.
Yep.
You've got a part B, which is mostly sodium bicarbonate. It's got a little bit of sodium carbonate in it, but it's mostly sodium bicarbonate. And then you've got a part C. Part C consists of everything that's in seawater, all 70 trace elements, magnesium, potassium, all of that, in the proportions in natural seawater, with no calcium and no alkalinity.
And no salts, like no sodium.
And no sodium chloride.
Perfect.
All right.
Okay.
And that is the key.
Right.
Because with your part A, calcium chloride, the animals are going to take and use the calcium. Right. That leaves you with the chloride. There's nothing you can do about that. If you got calcium chloride and you use the calcium, you're left with the chloride.
Right.
All right. From the part B, you've got your sodium carbonate or sodium bicarbonate. The animals are going to use the carbonate along with that calcium that they got from A in order to make their calcium carbonate matrix, their shell, or their skeleton. And they're going to leave you then with the sodium.
More sodium.
More sodium. So you've got the sodium left over from the part B. You've got the chloride left over from the part A. And in some ways that's super convenient because sodium and chloride have a tremendous chemical affinity for each other.
Yep.
And they end up as sodium chloride, which is salt.
Yep. And
in sea salt, about 70% of sea salt is sodium chloride. So you're not creating anything toxic or anything that's a problem. You're just creating a little bit more of what's already 70% of what's in your system.
Yeah, sounds pretty convenient.
The problem is, and the big solve that balling does with this, is that the more sodium chloride you have in the system, the less of everything else that you're going to have. So let's talk about that for a second, because that's the part that people have a little trouble getting their head around.
Because if nothing else is changing, you just have more sodium, you still have the same amount, you just have saltier water, right?
No.
Okay.
So think about it this way.
Okay.
You've got this solution in your system that is about 70% sodium chloride and 30% other stuff, okay? Now, granted, the vast majority of that other stuff is magnesium and potassium, but there's also 70 trace elements in that other stuff.
Right.
So 70% sodium chloride, 30% other stuff. Now, we go over to your tank one day and we dump in a bunch of table salt, a bunch of sodium chloride only.
Okay.
All right? What does that do to your salinity?
It's going to go up.
It's going to go up. So we need to bring that salinity down.
Right.
So we're going to dilute it with some RODI water.
Yeah,
right?
That makes sense.
And we're going to bring it down. So maybe it went from 35 PSU up to 36 PSU. We're going to put some fresh water, RODI water in to bring it back down to 35 PSU. The problem is that you're diluting everything. You're not selectively diluting that extra sodium chloride you put in. You're diluting everything. So what happens is you bring that back down to 35 PSU. But now instead of 70% sodium chloride and 30% other stuff, maybe you're 75% sodium chloride and 25% other stuff. The more sodium chloride you have at the same salinity requires that there be a little less of everything else, or your salinity is too high.
Right, and so normally what we do in that situation is we'd be testing for alkalinity in calcium and magnesium, and we might be like, okay, now that I've diluted, those levels are a bit low, I'm gonna add that back. Which
makes your trace elements go down even further, because now you're adding more salts, right? You're not adding sodium chloride, but you're still adding more salts, which is going to raise that salinity.
And then you do that process
Then you're going to dilute it again, which is going to dilute everything and bring those trace elements down even more. So the more other stuff you add to make up for that dilution that you've done, the more you're
exacerbating
down.
The issue.
Exactly. So, and the way Balling deals with this was really brilliant. You've got a certain amount of part A going in, which is your sodium chloride. Calcium chloride, sorry. You've got a certain amount of part B going in, which is your sodium bicarbonate. And we can calculate very easily how much sodium chloride is going to be left over from those additions. And what the part C does is to add the exact amount of that everything else.
In the correct ratios.
In the correct ratios of natural seawater to equalize that excess sodium chloride that we created from the A and B. Now the salinity still goes up, but everything is going up, not just the sodium chloride.
Because you're dosing that as well.
You're adding that extra stuff. So everything goes up. Now when you add your RODI water to dilute that salinity, you're diluting everything back to the 35 PSU.
But everything at this point is already in the correct ratio with each other because you're bringing up, so you're technically raising your trace elements, let's say, a little bit higher than natural seawater by adding this along with this. But every time you do that adjustment to bring that salinity back down, you're bringing those trace elements back down to natural seawater instead of them kind of falling lower and then diluting and then falling even lower. We're just dosing them along with it, so everything goes up, everything comes back down together.
Exactly, and the cool thing about the true Balling method is that, and this is true of part 2, the salinity change is quite small. So this happens over time. And you make those corrections almost inadvertently and naturally just by the natural water changes that you're doing, by the top-off water that you do. You almost don't see that rise in salinity.
Yeah, if you skim wet even, you're pulling water out of the system.
Exactly. So you don't really see this happening unless you're monitoring it really closely. If you monitor it super closely, you can see that change in the sodium chloride.
So this is basically solving for like a long-term deficiency issue. Something that you're not going to see in like a month of reefing or 2 months of reefing necessarily, but after, 6 months, things could be going a little bit sideways and you not be able to peg exactly why unless you're testing trace elements. And this basically prevents you from ending up in that situation.
That's mostly true, except if you really look at this chemically, the interesting thing is that this change with the sodium chloride happens in really drastically in the beginning. You don't see the effects until later, but if you look at what I call bench chemistry, and you check this on a bench, on a chemistry counter, and you really look at it, the change happens really rapidly. You just don't see that effect until quite a bit down the road.
That makes sense.
So now, of course, the question becomes, when is Balling the best method to use? When is Balling?
It sounds like it's always kind of the best method.
Well, it's not always the easiest. It's not always the most convenient.
I guess you're right, because then, like, a lot of dosing pumps out there are 3-pump dosing pumps, but if you're only using 2 dosing pumps and you want to do this, you're adding another
Yeah,
dosing pump,
exactly.
or you're dosing 3 things by hand instead
So
of 2.
all of these things that we're going to talk about have advantages and disadvantages, right? The way I like to look at it is not what's best and better, but what are the advantages and the disadvantages?
Okay.
The disadvantage of the balling, of the true balling method, is that you need 3 dosing pumps.
Yes.
Or you need to manually dose 3 different liquids.
Right.
That's the disadvantage of it.
Okay.
Right? The big advantage of the balling method is when there's inconsistency in the amount of calcium and alkalinity being used. Now let's talk about that for a second, because this is going to come up again when we're talking about other methods. And so it's a good thing to understand at the beginning of this, because we're going to come back, we're going to revisit this issue a number of times. So the corals, when they, and this is true actually of clams and coralline algae, any type of encrusting coral, anything that builds a calcium carbonate shell or matrix or skeleton.
Snails even, yeah.
Snails, right? Yeah. They're going to use a certain amount of calcium and a certain amount of alkalinity in order to make that calcium carbonate matrix, right? The proportion of calcium to alkalinity that you're using when you're using the balling A and B, and C for that matter, is that proportion.
Okay.
Now, the hitch comes in where some systems, and I'm tempted to say many systems because I deal with this with a lot of different people, but I'm going to say some systems use more alkalinity than, let me rephrase that. Some systems use more alkalinity per unit of calcium than the corals themselves use.
So alkalinity's being pulled out of the system in another way. So not by coral growth, but
that's
by something
not
else.
Also using calcium at the same proportion.
Right.
Using alkalinity alone.
So what's an example of what might cause alkalinity to fall without calcium actually going with it?
It's pretty simple. It usually comes down to one of 3 things.
Okay.
Circulation, aeration, or CO2. So if there's a lot of CO2 that's constantly lowering the pH, and that alkalinity is constantly replenishing the pH, that's an example of alkalinity that's getting used that's not also using calcium.
Right, because it's being used to buffer pH.
Yeah, exactly. In a system like that, if there's a lot of CO2 in the house, then, or the tanks in the basement, because CO2 is heavy, sometimes that's the issue, then the amount of alkalinity that's being used by the system, by the tank system, is much greater than the amount of alkalinity that's being used by the corals.
Right.
All right. So if you have a fixed amount of alkalinity and calcium going into the system, like you do, say, with Reef, with the 1 part, which we'll talk about in a minute, you have no ability to adjust that.
Right.
And the big advantage of the balling method is that, let's say your tank needs 30 mLs of part A every day to keep up with its calcium, but it needs 50 mLs every day of part B to keep up with the alkalinity demand of the system.
Right.
All right. You can do that with the 3 parts of the balling method without any other product, without any other adjustments of anything. You can put in 30 of A and 50 of B, and now you're meeting all of the calcium and alkalinity requirements of the system.
Gotcha.
All right. So the big advantage of balling is you can tweak those alkalinity and calcium amounts independently. Now, the next question that always comes up is, well, how much part C do I have?
I was just going to ask that. So what do you tether part C to? Because I know a lot of people use alkalinity as their kind of judgment of how fast corals are growing.
Yeah.
But if alkalinity can be consumed by other things, that leads me to think that you'd actually want to tether part C's dose to the calcium and not the alkalinity.
Well, I'm going to make it one step either more complicated or simple. I'm not sure which this is going to do. There actually are systems, and I've run into them for some reason, mostly in Europe, not here in the US, but for some reason this seems to be true. There are some systems that actually use more calcium than alkalinity.
No kidding.
Now, of course, now you're going to say, well, what could use calcium that doesn't use alkalinity at the same time? And my answer is, I have no idea.
Fish. I have no clue.
I don't know why that happens. Yeah. But there are certain systems that do that. So I like to make a more general statement about part C.
Okay.
All right? Whatever is the lower volume of A or B that you're using, and 99% of the time it's going to be A is the lower volume, but whatever is the lower volume of A or B that you're using, that's the amount that you're going to use of C. That's the volume you're going to use of C.
That makes sense.
And my reasoning behind that is that that lower amount designates the amount of calcification that's happening with the associated other part. So that's going to be the amount of sodium chloride that's left over that we have to compensate for with the part C.
That makes sense. So just as an example, if you're 50 mil and 30 mil, let's say 30 mil.
Correct.
If you're 70 mil and 80 mil, 70 mil.
Yes.
Whatever the lower number is, doesn't matter which box it is, that's what you're going to follow.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because that whatever is using that other stuff is not creating excess sodium chloride.
Right.
So we don't have to compensate for it.
Right. Okay. That makes perfect sense.
All right. So that's the big advantage of the balling method, is this ability to tweak those different amounts going in.
Right.
That doesn't happen for everybody. Not everybody needs that tweak. All right. And if you don't need that tweak, then the possibilities open wide up.
Okay.
All right. If you're using 30 mLs of A and 30 mLs of B and 30 mLs of C every day in the balling method, we have way easier ways to do this than the balling method.
Awesome.
Okay. So that brings us to the alpha reef and the carbocalcium.
Okay.
Now, let's talk about the alpha reef first.
Please, it's my favorite additive. It is absolutely my favorite additive.
So alpha reef comes as either the liquid or the powder.
Okay.
The powder is just the ending solution that you will end up with is exactly the same.
Yeah, it's just dry form.
It's just the dry form.
Hydrate it yourself.
Way more economical in the powder if you're using big amounts, large amounts, rather than the liquid. The liquid is more convenient because you don't have to mix it up.
Right.
The alpha reef will supply calcium,
okay,
alkalinity,
yep,
magnesium,
yep,
and trace elements.
Yes. So like everything that you get in these boxes.
No, actually more.
Even more.
Even more, because even though, excuse me, even though part C has 70 trace elements in it, you're not supplementing for used trace elements.
Right.
All right?
That's an important
All you're doing is adding the correct amount of trace elements to offset that sodium chloride excess that was created. You're not making up for used
trace
elements.
Okay.
So then, of course, that begs the question, well, can I just add more C to add more magnesium and trace elements to my system? Another question I get a lot. And the answer is not the best way to do it. And the reason it's not the best way to do it is because part C is in the exact proportions of natural seawater, of all 70 trace elements.
Right.
And magnesium and potassium.
Right.
So that's not the preferred way to supplement the used trace elements. So, and there's so little in the part C because you're only offsetting that little bit of sodium chloride that you make. Part C is not the best way to do that.
Okay.
But what we just were talking about was that alpha reef has the 17 trace elements in it that we are going to be supplementing for used trace elements.
Okay.
Okay. And the balling method does not do that.
Okay.
Now, let's backtrack for a hair.
Okay.
Because you can make the balling method do this. There's a tweak.
Go on.
And the way to do that is you can add the trace K to the part A of the balling method, and you can add the trace A to the part B of the balling method, You can actually add those liquids together, and you do it at about 10% volume, by the way.
Okay.
And now when you're adding your part A of the balling method, you're adding the supplemental trace elements as well.
Okay.
And when you're adding the part B, you're adding the supplemental trace elements.
And you can mix those directly into the solution.
Directly into the solution.
So no extra dosing pumps or anything needed. You just, in the correct amount, you said 10%?
It's about 10% by volume.
You add that in, and now your part A and B are also dosing supplemental trace elements.
Correct. And that's an upgrade, so to speak, to the balling method. Hans Werner did the numbers. He made all of those additions possible. You cannot add, by the way, the trace A to the A. Then you get precipitation.
All right.
So the A, and the way to remember that is A is alkalinity. Part B is alkalinity. You can add the trace A to that.
Gotcha.
A for alkalinity.
Alkalinity goes to the alkalinity.
Yeah.
Alkalinity. A for alkalinity, except for when it's box A.
Was that clear, or did we just confuse everybody?
Clear as mud. No, okay. So, and then you've got A and K that go together, and then B and then A.
Right.
Okay, perfect.
And that's an upgrade to the balling method. Hans Werner did not come up with that in the 90s. That's a recent addition because of all this other stuff that's going on.
Gotcha.
He decided, oh, well, you can do that. And then you have the balling method also dealing with trace elements, supplemental trace elements, which it doesn't do on its own.
Balling method pro.
Yeah, man, I like that. I'll have to talk to Hans Werner about that. So now we got the Alpha Reef. The Alpha Reef is a single solution that'll give you calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, and trace elements. And then the question, of course, is, well, how does it do calcium and alkalinity at the same time, and you're not getting a precipitate?
Naturally. This is the thing for, like, when I started reefing 20 some odd years ago, this was like the unicorn that everybody wanted, because we didn't want to have to do all this different stuff. Like, the one question I always got when I was working in an aquarium store was, why do you have one thing I can put in that does all of it? And the answer was always no, and I was like, I wish it happened. So I love this stuff, but I'm gonna let you continue.
Well, the way it happens is that the carbonates are not actually carbonates in the solution.
Right.
All right. You've got the calcium, and it's calcium formate. And what happens is when you put this in your system, the calcium goes into solution, and you can measure that pretty rapidly. But the formate gets metabolized by bacteria and turns into the alkalinity, into the carbonates.
Okay.
So it doesn't exist as carbonates in the solution to cause that calcium carbonate precipitate that you would cause if you put calcium chloride and sodium bicarbonate together.
Right, it would turn into a block.
All right. Now, there are other ways historically to do this with calcium acetate.
Which is, from my understanding, not very safe.
Well, it's not safe as a major additive, in my opinion, because the acetate requires so much biological activity. It works roughly the same way. The problem is that the acetate requires so much biological activity in order to convert it from acetate into carbonates that it uses a tremendous amount of oxygen. And so if your tank is growing well and you need a lot of calcium and alkalinity, you reach a point where you can't add enough calcium acetate to the tank to meet that demand because your oxygen depletion is too much.
So basically, in order to try to meet that demand, if you used enough of it, you'd suffocate the tank.
Essentially, yeah. Now, so the calcium formate uses a fraction of the metabolic activity, so there's very little, if any, oxygen depletion.
Right.
And we have people, I mean, we have a recommended dose for the Alpha Reef, but we have people that are literally using 3 and 4, makes me cringe, but we literally have people using 3 and 4 times the amount of Alpha Reef that we recommend as a maximum dose, having no issues whatsoever.
I completely ignored the maximum dose on this. So there was a tank at BRS that was an SPS-dominated system, and they were way above the recommended dose.
I'm pretty sure that was 3 or 4 times the recommended
so
dose.
some of you guys might remember, I had a SPS reef tank down here. It was the Ocean Guard tank, 120 gallons roughly. and I used nothing but all for Reef, and I was above, by the time, you know, I had the tank full of corals, I was above 50 mil. That's too much mil, according to the bottle. But the tank did extremely well. Like, I was skeptical. Anything that sounds too good to be true, and I'm like, I have to test it, because otherwise the skeptic in me is like, there's got to be a catch. There's a kind of catch, I guess, which I'm sure you'll tell us about in a minute, but I love this because it does exactly what it says it's going to do, and it does it well. And I run a Trident, and I can watch my alkalinity go up and down. Sure, it's not literally instantaneous. You add it in and it goes up, but within a couple of hours, like,
sometimes it takes as much as a couple of days for the full amount to go in.
The alkalinity starts climbing, right? And when you're dosing with a dosing pump on a regular basis, sure, it might be a little bit of a delay with whatever your alkalinity is set at, but you still get to see a trend, and I can still adjust the dosing pump all the same. It's one dosing pump.
Well, we actually recommend that before you start all for Reef, if you're coming over from some other form, you get your alkalinity and your calcium where you want them, and then use the all for Reef to maintain it there.
Yeah.
It's actually not my product of choice for raising calcium or alkalinity.
That makes perfect sense.
But it is absolutely my product of choice for maintaining it there.
Is.
And the funny thing about it is that people that switch over to it within a few weeks see differences in their tank and in the health of their corals. We get so many calls from people that say, you know, oh, I was using XYZ and now I'm using the all for Reef and my tank never looks so good. Most of the time, the reason that happens is not because the calcium formate is doing something amazing to their calcium and alkalinity. But most of the time that happens is because they were not doing adequate trace element additions before. And now with the all for Reef, automatically they're getting the magnesium and the trace elements without even trying. It's just happening.
Yeah.
And for the first time, those systems are getting the trace elements that they need, and that's causing the real difference. Where if they were using, say, the Bolling method, if they had just added the A and K to it, they would have gotten a similar result. This is just so much simpler if you're using equal amounts of the A and the B.
Absolutely.
Now, interesting aside from the all for Reef is that all for Reef actually starts out as carbocalcium, all right? Carbocalcium is the calcium formate alone.
So that'll do calcium and alkalinity.
Only. Calcium and alkalinity only. Once we saw how well the calcium formate worked for calcium and alkalinity addition, and we realized that we could put magnesium and trace elements in it, that's where the all for Reef came from. But originally, and this did not play out to be true, this is one of those things that, you know, you develop something and you think it's going one way and then you find out, no, that's not the way it's going. We originally thought, and you will see very often recommendations for all for Reef used on smaller systems and carbocalcium to be used on larger systems. And here's the reason we originally made that recommendation. It turned out to be completely incorrect. We originally made the recommendation because the theory was that in a larger system where you're doing smaller percentage water changes, that if you're adding a certain ratio of calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, and trace elements, without the ability to adjust that ratio, that in a larger system with smaller water changes, you would eventually see an imbalance in maybe the magnesium would go up too high or go down too low because you're always adding the same amount. The trace elements might run off. So the idea was all for Reef in the smaller systems, which generally get a larger percentage water change because it's easy to do.
Yeah.
You know, you're changing
5 gallons on a 20
gallons in a 20-gallon system, right? Where in a 150 or a 300-gallon system, you're changing 20 gallons.
Yeah, you're not changing 75 gallons.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea was that the carbocalcium would give you more control. You use the carbocalcium for your calcium and alkalinity. You use your biomagnesium for the magnesium that you would need. And then you use your trace A and your trace K for the trace element supplementation.
Right.
Well, it turned out that in practical use, nobody gets a magnesium imbalance. Nobody gets a trace element imbalance. Now, I can't explain why, because I know a lot of tanks that will all of a sudden use a lot of magnesium, or all of a sudden use almost no magnesium, right? I was absolutely 100% sure we would see this, particularly magnesium imbalance in larger systems.
Right. Doesn't
seem to happen.
Interesting.
So what's happening now is that everybody's using all for Reef, no matter what size the system is. We're now special ordering it in larger buckets for maintenance companies that are using all for Reef, and for users with larger systems. BRS doesn't have that SKU yet, but
I want it.
Maybe will at some time.
I'm still using so much of this in my systems that like this container doesn't last long enough.
Well,
they have to send me so many.
We'll work out something
Yay!
for you. But carbocalcium seems to be getting used less and less, because the advantages of having one single solution to dose all of that, if you're not ever seeing that imbalance, is just undeniable.
It's incredibly convenient. And you know what? In a hobby where like some people love tinkering, some people are not tinkerers. They don't want to do like a tremendous amount of testing and a tremendous amount of math to get all their levels right. That's just overwhelming. Yeah. But they love the animals and they love the experience. This is such a great product because it distills it all down to something that is so much easier to work with.
And you can make adjustments when you need to.
Yeah.
So there is a fixed amount of calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, and trace elements in the all-for-Reef. So let's say you've got one of these systems like we were talking about before with Bali, where the alkalinity needs more. Super simple to fix. Use the all-for-Reef for your calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, and trace elements. And then get some balling B, and from time to time, when your alkalinity is lagging a little bit, then you use a balling B addition to bring that alkalinity back up. And if that is the case, then my recommendation is to use the calcium as the indicator for your dose amount of the all-for-Reef. That way, your calcium is where you want it to be.
Right.
Your alkalinity will drop a little bit. You add your balling B once a week or however often you need to in order to supplement that extra alkalinity. If you have one of those very rare systems where it's opposite, where it's the calcium that is less,
right.
Then what you do is use still the alkalinity for the indicator for your all-for-Reef dosage. And as you see your calcium drop, you use some balling A to make that up that extra calcium.
Right.
So you can tweak. Oh, and if your magnesium drops, use a little biomagnesium to bring that extra magnesium up. So you can tweak and make adjustments in the long run when you're using all-for-Reef. But I can't actually explain it, but it doesn't seem to be needed as often as I would think it's needed.
Yeah, I can say from personal experience with the two systems that I've used all-for-Reef on, including that huge SPS system, I had very little fluctuation that I had to deal with at all.
Yeah.
I tend to run CO2 scrubbers on my skimmer and stuff. There's a lot of, we're in the basement right now, and there's a lot of CO2 down here, especially when I'm screaming at a camera all day and I'm just breathing like crazy. So, and you got 3 bodies right now in the room. I'm sure that it's high, but that really does prevent, you know, having that excess alkalinity just drained off. So I personally did not experience, and I ran that tank for probably a year and a bit, maybe a little bit longer. I never adjusted anything separately. I was just using the all-for-Reef.
Yeah, I mean, you sometimes need to make adjustments, but sometimes you don't. Yeah. Sometimes it just runs, you know, the right proportions are in here if everything is running the way it should. When we get those adjustments from CO2 or circulation, or there's an area of detritus that's releasing a lot of amino acids, that kind of, then you do need adjustments. But most people find that they don't need adjustments.
Yeah.
Now, we should talk about some other methods, because there are still other methods.
What do you mean? That's the only method for me.
So I'm just going to recap for a second.
Absolutely.
We've got the true balling method. where the disadvantage is you need 3 solutions and 3 dosing pumps or 3 manual additions. The advantage is you can tweak the amount of each thing going in. Okay? You've got the Reef or the carbocalcium. Disadvantage is no ability to tweak. If you're going to tweak something, you need another product to add. The big advantage, 1 dosing pump for all that stuff.
One thing.
And you may not need to tweak, so big advantage. But there are other ways to do this, all right? So we should talk about the bulk reef supply hybrid
method,
balling method. And why that even exists.
Why does it exist, Lou?
Well, I can tell you why it exists.
I'm curious.
It exists, number one, because bulk reef supply wants to be able to sell their products. But also, the more important reason that it exists is that the original balling method, the part B that gives the alkalinity, is mostly sodium bicarbonate. And it is the limiting factor as to how much concentration you can get into the part A and into the part C. Let me explain that. You can only get a certain amount of sodium bicarbonate into solution before it's going to precipitate. So you've got a saturated solution essentially, all right? The amount of part A concentration that goes with the bicarbonate amount of solution is way under the saturation level of the calcium chloride. And the part C is even further under the saturation level. So in bulk reef supply, the part B is soda ash, which is sodium carbonate. And the sodium carbonate gives you about twice the alkalinity. So now you can concentrate the part A almost twice and the part C almost twice. So that now you're dosing less of each one. All right? A really cool way to do it, because the balling method is I'm not going to say it's somewhat dilute, but Reef is like 30 times as concentrated as the balling method is. So the amount, if you're adding, 30 milliliters of balling of each one, you're going to add like 5 milliliters of Reef.
So this sounds like a good way, like if you've got less cabinet space and you've got dosing pumps and you've got your dosing containers under there and they're not huge and you want to fill them up less often, then the BRS hybrid balling method sounds like a good way to almost double up on the time between filling those containers up.
Absolutely. It's a really good modification of the original balling method. And I believe you can do the same thing with the trace A and the trace K by adding those in so that you're doing the trace element addition at exactly the same time. And just remember, you're still going to use the part C of the balling method. You're just going to double up on it. And you need that in order to balance that sodium chloride that is still created by the calcium chloride of the bulk reef supply hybrid method part A and the hybrid method part B sodium carbonate. You're still getting that sodium chloride left over, and that's why you need the part C. But now you can double it because
you've got twice the concentration in your other ones. So you're just bringing it up to match them so that that whole system still works properly. That makes sense.
All right. So now we should talk about, also we should mention Kalkwasser. I'm not a huge fan.
I could tell when you looked at it.
I'm not against using Kalkwasser. Let me make that clear. I'm not against using Kalkwasser. I do have a few issues with it though. The first issue I have with it is that most people that talk to me about using Kalkwasser want to use it to get the pH boost that you get with
primarily. That's like the number one reason
thing
that I hear about people using it.
And I'm against doing that.
Go on.
Well, it's my own personal preference. But reef tanks, because of all of the calcium carbonate that exists in a reef tanks really want to be around 8.0. Like in pH. They really want to be there. So if you're experiencing much lower pH than that on a regular basis, I would rather help you figure out, why is your tank running low in pH? Is it CO2? Is it circulation? Is there some other issue? Why is it running low in pH? And have it naturally find its level at 8.0 or 8.2 or thereabouts, rather than add something to artificially push it up.
Yeah.
Because my concern there is what happens when that then doesn't go in, right?
Yeah.
The calcium drop, if your Kalkwasser is not going in, is not as much of an issue. But your alkalinity and your pH drop, those are issues.
Yeah.
So I always like to see tanks not maintaining themselves, but having a certain level that they like to be at on their own.
A healthy baseline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Kalkwasser, from that standpoint, is not my favorite thing to go to when it is the primary source of calcium and alkalinity addition. Okay? There's another reason. The other reason is the amount of calcium and alkalinity that results from the addition of the Kalkwasser is quite small. So it's very dilute. Yeah. And often what happens is people are depending on the Kalkwasser in their makeup water in order to supply their calcium and alkalinity. And if the tank is growing well, the amount of makeup water that they need is less than the amount of Kalkwasser that you need.
You're going to cap. Basically, so what I think you're saying basically is that you're going to get to a point with the biomass in the tank and how much growth is happening that the evaporation in the tank will not be enough to allow you to get the amount of calcium and alkalinity you need into the system solely through your ATO.
Yeah.
It won't match up.
Right, exactly. So then you need some other form of getting...
Then you're into something else anyway.
Something else anyway, right. Yeah. So let's talk about that something else anyway, because this is a call that I've been getting lately a lot, and also I've seen a lot of comments on forums about this, using Kalkwasser along with Reef.
Okay, sure.
I've seen this a lot lately.
This is what people are trying to do?
Yeah,
okay.
And they're trying to use the Kalkwasser to get that little bit of pH boost along with the Reef. Does it work? Yes. Can you do it? Yes. However, here's what you have to think about. Every amount of calcium and alkalinity that you're getting from your Kalkwasser, forget about the pH boost just for a second. Every amount of calcium and alkalinity that you're getting from your Kalkwasser that you're not getting from your Reef is decreasing the amount of trace elements and magnesium that you're getting from the
I hadn't even considered that. I should, because I got this sitting right here, but I hadn't even considered that.
So the more Kalkwasser you're using, taking up however much Reef you would be using, is causing less trace elements and magnesium to go into the system.
But then you got to add it. But then why? Then you're into more stuff. Then why are you doing Reef?
Now you're adding tons of other products.
So you basically end up in a position where you've nullified the benefit of Reef.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes. So go back to the balling method if you're going to do it that way.
Yeah, the BRS hybrid method.
Or the BRS hybrid method.
Something that'll allow you.
Right. So I don't really see the use of this that much. That being said, there was a day when this was the only way you could add alkalinity and calcium to the system, in one solution.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, no, back in the day, there actually was a really good use for this.
There's reason reactors exist for this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But when we start talking about the pH boost, that's a whole discussion that I like to have with people, and I much rather help them figure out why is their tank running low in pH. And by the way, 7.8 to 8.0, if your tank is, there's always going to be about a 0.2 range, right?
Yeah.
We'd love to see it at 8.0 to 8.2, right? Love to see that. Measure it in the morning, right before the lights go on, measure it in the evening, right after the lights go out. You should see about a 0.2 drift, and 8.0 to 8.2, great, no problem. 7.8 to 8.0 is the low end of the scale.
Yeah.
But I know a million tanks that run at 7.8 to 8.0 that look amazing.
Yeah.
Now, there is a trend and a whole movement to run high pH, right? High pH, high alkalinity, high calcium, trying to get increased growth of the corals.
Yeah.
Here's my take on that. And I may be different than everybody else in the hobby when it comes to this. But here's my feeling about it. Corals have been growing like weeds, taking over hundreds of thousands of acres of ocean for literally hundreds of thousands of years at 8.0 to 8.2.
Yep.
At 420 to 440 calcium, at 1290 magnesium. We are not going to figure out a better way to do this in 100 years of reef keeping than a few 100,000 years of the way these corals have been growing. And I'm not a religious person at all, but I do believe that the guy that designed the ocean knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
And it was designed, I don't want to say he, I'll get a million comments about that, but the corals have been doing just fine in the ocean before the Industrial Revolution, and we started dumping a bunch of crap in the ocean. So I really think that we need to go to school on the ocean.
Yeah.
And there's a reason the ocean pH is what it is. There's a reason the ocean calcium and alkalinity is what it is. There's a reason the temperature is what it is. And those animals do very well and grow very nicely in those conditions. You know, we've proven with studies in Europe numerous times that if you elevate, if you increase the growth rate of particularly Acropora, the growth is not the same.
It's brittle.
You know, you can take them and snap them in your hand.
Absolutely.
The physical form of the growth is not exactly the same.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a natural lesson to be learned, and not a fan of running higher than 8.4 pH. Not a fan of running 550 calcium with 12 DKH to get quicker growth. I think that we go with natural seawater parameters or close to that.
You know, I would agree on the most part. The only reason that I think anybody should run slightly elevated parameters, and I think this is something Ryan's talked about a lot in the past too, is just to give yourself a buffer.
Yes.
Not because the corals are gonna like grow 3 times faster if we've got 9 DKH alkalinity and 500 calcium and 1500 magnesium. It's because if something happens and life gets busy or whatever, you're not able to, a dosing pump fails, you're not able to add your elements in at the times you're supposed to maintain perfect spot on levels for ocean water, you have a buffer where they can slowly come down without your coral suffering, giving you time to catch it so that you can make sure that that's corrected. The idea of like supercharging coral growth, this has always been my opinion on that. We're not trying to supercharge coral growth. We're trying to make sure our corals always have what they need so they grow at the rate they're meant to grow at.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, just give them what they need. They'll grow as fast as they can grow.
I mean, natural seawater is 6.5 DKH. We keep our tanks 7 to 9.
Yeah.
So you've got that little bit of buffer in
exactly.
there. You know, calcium is something that corals are not super sensitive to a slightly higher calcium level. Natural seawater, 420 to 440, you keep your tank at 480 or 490 or 500, you're fine.
Yeah.
You know, but it's those super elevated levels that I'm talking about that we want to, you know, maybe rethink that a little bit. Yeah. So for those reasons, especially in relation to pH, calc-phosphor is not my first choice. I think it might be a good fix if you're having issues and you're trying to figure it out and you need some time to figure things out. But I think it's more of an older school approach that's maybe losing favor a little bit. It had tremendous advantage when it was the only way you could do calcium and alkalinity in a single solution. But now that there's carbocalcium and Reef, I'm not so sure that the advantage is there. And I want to come back to that one point because I'm hearing about it so much. If every bit of calc-phosphor that you're using, that you're not using your Reef for, is decreasing the amount of trace elements and magnesium that are going in that system and lessening that positive effect that you get from the alpha reef.
Which just means, in the simplest terms, if you're going to do this, that you should use a different method so that you can balance it out. Otherwise, you're just going to run into deficiencies.
Yeah, but I'm coming out really negative on CalFuster, and I don't mean to do that, but you know, it's just not my first choice.
No, absolutely. And there are CalFuster products that have some things added. Like I'm pretty sure Brightwell has one that's got like magnesium or something, but that won't address the rest of the trace elements.
Yeah, exactly.
Just magnesium could be great. Like it's one less thing you have to worry about, but like that's not going to be there. Like there's other problems. So I get it.
If you want to do a single solution,
yes.
Alpha Reef's the way to go.
I love Alpha.
So I think we've hit pretty much all of the
you know what? I do have one more question.
Okay.
Because I know before this existed, that this existed.
Yes.
So my question is, if I were, I love Alpha Reef. I want to dose Alpha Reef. Maybe I just have one dosing pump, and the next time I mix up a batch, I notice my tank is using too much alkalinity or something like that. Can I change the ratio of this manually when I'm making this up to better suit my tank specifically, or am I much better off just using one of these to make up the difference?
Well, those are just going to be calcium and alkalinity, which is that alone. So if you need more calcium alkalinity and not more magnesium and not more trace elements,
then I'd have to go this way.
No, then you can do this.
Oh, okay.
You absolutely can. Just put in less trace elements and less magnesium.
Okay.
That was the whole reason that this existed, was to allow you to make those kind of tweaks.
Right.
But as I said, the practical experience is proving out that nobody has really needed to do that. If you need to do that, you absolutely can. You can use the amount of carbocalcium. There's the formula on the BRS website for making the Alpha Reef. By the way, I get a lot of calls of people saying, well, if I do this formula, is it similar to the Alpha Reef? It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. Just way easier to get one powder and mix it up. But it's exactly the same. But if you need to tweak the amount of trace elements and magnesium going into the system with the calcium, and you want to do it with the calcium and the alkalinity, and you want to do it in a single solution, no reason at all you can't do this and adjust those levels. Absolutely. Okay. That's the reason this existed. But most people don't need to do that.
Yeah, I haven't needed to, which is, I'm pretty sure these are all the bottles that I've had for a while now, because I keep just using Alpha Reef. Originally, I thought I was going to use it, and I just never have had to.
Originally, we thought you were going to use it. And originally, we thought there were going to be a lot of people, especially with larger systems. Again, you know, we've talked a million times I've talked with you about it, I've talked with Ryan about it, about water changes being the great equalizing factor, right?
Absolutely.
Every time you do a water change, you're pushing your tank in a neutral direction, in a good direction. But this idea of being able to do higher percentage water changes in smaller systems easily, and larger systems getting generally smaller percent water changes, made us feel like this was going to definitely be a thing.
Right.
And it turns out it's not really.
No.
This seems to work even in the larger systems, hence our 5-gallon buckets now.
Man.
You know what's going to happen now. I'm going to get a call from BRS. Everyone wants the 5-gallon buckets. We need to get the 5-gallon buckets in, which we can do. We've brought a small number of them in, and we can bring more.
I am excited for it. I'm not lying. Ever since I had that 120 SPS system, I've been bugging them to get buckets. I think I even emailed you at one point asking if it's going to come in a larger size, and at the time it didn't, but it's revolutionary. It is the thing. I get way too gassed up on this stuff. You have to understand though, like when you come from a world of everything being separate and wanting to simplify, I've said it so many times, and if you haven't heard me say, I'm the world's laziest reefer. Like, I love having a reef tank. I don't want to deal with anything extra that I don't have to deal with. So I will do this, but the second I don't have to and things have gotten easier, I switched over. And 20 years ago, everybody wanted this, never existed. Nobody thought it was going to be possible. It just didn't seem like a good thing because everything was going to either precipitate or it was a little bit dangerous. So now that this exists, it's super safe, super easy to use, and I've been able to, I'm skeptic by nature. I was able to prove to myself that it works.
Yeah.
Like this is the only thing I want, but just to recap, like if you are the kind of person who wants to make sure that your elements are always staying where they should be and you don't want to end up having to deal with the dilution of trace elements through extra sodium going into the water, sodium chloride going into the water, the balling method's going to get you there, and it's going to make sure that it doesn't drop. And then if you want to take it a step further and make sure you always have trace elements going in additively to make up for consumption of trace elements by the critters in the aquarium, your corals and everything else, you're going to do the pro balling method. I'm just going to start calling it that, where you're doing balling method plus a little bit of addition.
Balling plus.
Balling plus.
Balling
Love
plus.
it. Balling plus. If you want to be able to do something extremely similar to this, but let's say you want to be able to mix up a more concentrated version, or you want to be able to offset maybe the CO2 in your system a little bit and get that alkalinity a little bit higher, then you can do the soda ash version with the BRS Pharma BRS hybrid balling method.
That's a mouthful.
It really is. Can we come up with a better moniker for that? That'd be great. So then you just basically are replacing the A and B with the BRS two-part with soda ash. This is going to make it so that you can have smaller dosing containers, or if you already have smaller dosing containers, you want them to go further, that'll do that. The soda ash is also going to just make it possible to keep that pH a little bit higher. That's your guy. If you're like me and you just want to have as little dosing pumps and things to take care of as possible and just one thing to worry about, All for Reef is absolutely amazing. If for some reason you want All for Reef just to have the single dosing pump, but you have a higher consumption of anything trace element related or magnesium related, then you can do this guy over here, which is your All for Reef. What would you call that? All for Reef manual version?
Not manual version, but
do it yourself.
Do it yourself.
It's like a do-it-yourself All for Reef. So you have all the components.
Deconstructed.
There you go. Deconstructed.
I'm an old food industry guy.
I love it.
So
I was just going to say.
It's deconstructed All for Reef.
So that you can get the ratios that you'd like for the magnesium and the trace elements, which you're only going to do if you're testing trace elements separately. Question.
Yeah.
If you are going to be dosing A and K, what test kit would you use for A and or K?
No, you got to use ICP.
ICP is the only way to go. So it's not tied to one specific element.
You're talking about trace elements here.
Yeah.
That are not that there are no test kits for. There may be a test kit for one or two of these. I'd have to look back and see. But these are trace elements, and you generally don't have.
You don't want to tie it to one trace element.
No.
Okay, perfect. So unless you're doing ICP, stick with the middle guy. Man. So there really isn't one like perfect way to do this. It's whatever's going to work for you.
Yeah, that's the big point that we should end with, on this whole video thing, is that there's no best way. There's lots of different ways to do this. There's reasons you would do one or the other. And the best way is what's going to work best for your system, the way your system runs.
Yeah, and the way you want to run your system, which is important, because if you're not in...
Some people love to tweak and be mad scientists, and some people want to just like add something and be done.
Yeah, exactly. So stop getting caught up in this whole war on which way to dose is the best. The answer is it's whatever way is going to work best for you and your system. And yeah, no more arguments.
And if you still have questions, put them down in the comments. I'll do my best to try to answer them.
Yeah, Lou's awesome. He's a smart guy. I love having him here. And he will be in the comments.
And I don't pay him much to say that either.
He doesn't pay me anything. I get absolutely nothing for gassing up Lou. I just really like him. So in the next video, because we've done a bunch of these, we're going to be talking about something that is really exciting to me. and that is what's coming out next. This was the big thing for the longest time. This was going to be the next revolution in reef keeping, and especially when it comes to chemicals and dosing. I want to know what's next, because for some reason my brain can't come up with anything. This is the only thing I've been thinking about for 20 years.
I got 2 things.
He's got, oh my God. Okay, so we're gonna get on that right now. You can check it out in this video right here. There's also a playlist there if you want to see the rest of the videos we've done, so have a watch.